Hello. Great pleasure to introduce a returning speaker. He was there last SuriCon, Champ Clark III. Looking forward to the talk. As last year was very interesting as well. Today, I think he's going to talk about how to mine Suricata logs for threat intel with Sagan, since Sagan can natively decode Suricata if JSON logs. So, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Let me just get set up here real quick. Oops. Well. All right. So how's everybody doing? All right. As it says, my name is Champ Clark. I'm the CTO at Quadrant Information Security. Today I'm going to be talking about using Sagan to take in E files from Suricata to mine it for threat intelligence. These are, things like IP addresses, hashes, things of that nature that you might want to be on the lookout for. So first off, what is Sagan? Sagan is a multi-threaded platform. It's a log analysis engine. We typically take in logs from things like Windows servers and syslog servers, so Cisco routers, your firewalls and whatnot. And then what the engine does is uses a very Suricata-like rule set to generate alerts based off of the type of events that happen within your logs. It's not to be confused with something like, for instance, like an elk stack or Elasticsearch front end or anything like that. This is meant to be as a kind of a buffer in between. So you write the rules to trigger off the logs. So that's basically a rundown of that. So last year in Vancouver at the end of SuriCon, where everybody gets together and kind of like talks about what they would like to see in Suricata, one of the big things that we noticed was a lot of talk about threat intel and having that directly into Suricata. And as I said, that's what we heard a lot about. But the fact is that there's some issues that we saw at that particular time. Suricata is already really busy doing packet analysis, and a lot of times, depending on the way that you want to do threat intel lookups, it can be very, very expensive. It was kind of cool to find out today that there's the data sets option that's coming along in Suricata. That sounds awesome. At that time, it wasn't really built into Suricata. So that was some of the problems that we saw immediately. A lot of the people also wanted the data to be very dynamic. That is, be able to add into it and have multiple sensors, read from one data set, so to speak. So it needed to be very dynamic, because static files aren't always easy the static IP address files, for instance, aren't always easy to deal with. They're not as flexible. And being able to add and remove data on the fly is also important, because sometimes even despite our best efforts or even the sources that you get threat intel feeds from, some of the data that you get may or may not be that great. So for instance, IP addresses I've actually seen like IP addresses of IOCs of 8.8.8.8. Well, that's not going to do you very well with your threat intel research. There was also a big thing about data being able to be weighted out. So for instance, when an attacker sets up a platform and they're using it to attack a network, they may use that for several different months or whatnot. But the fact is, actually, attackers also know about threat intel as well. So they also leverage it as well. This has been documented before. Basically, my point is they'll use a clean IP address to attack certain places. And once us researchers get together and we say, hey, we see a common IP address or a common hash that gets used, then they typically changed out their tactics. When they do that, that data gets old, but we, as researchers, continually look for the same sort of thing. So the data needs to be aged out over time if we don't see it. So that's kind of the problem there. So the data becomes less valuable as it gets older. we want to be able to age it out and whatnot. In our opinion, especially at this point in time, was that the threat intel lookups should actually happen outside of Suricata. Suricata is already writing out all these great E files that have lots and lots of data into it, and we make an engine that can ingest these E files. And so the idea is that this should probably be done post-analysis, post-traffic analysis by Suricata, and then looking at the actual E files and doing the mining there on what we want to look for. So the ultimate goal is to, of course, look for things like IP addresses, hashes, J3, file names, URLs, anything else that we can get, and then perform the threat intel queries against the database. And remember, I'm not talking about just one sensor being able to look into, say, a particular file. That might work on your platform, but maybe you have, I don't know, 10 sensors out in the field, and you want them to all be able to look at a centralized place to look for threat intel. So the first thing for us to identify was the ways to gather the data from Suricata, the E files. And there's actually a couple of ways to do that. One of them is a program I wrote called Mir that we originally wrote as kind of just as a replacement for Barnyard 2, as Unified 2 was going away, and we were tired of Unified 2 and just wanted something better. Mir has, over the last year, has this new output function where basically Suricata can write out to an E file, Mir can suck it up, and then Mir can take that data and put it into a named pipe or FIFO, or Sagan can read it, which has its advantages and disadvantages, mostly in the fact that everything has to run on that one machine. So if you're already CPU bound, you might not want to be stacking more load on top of the machine. The other way that we found that we like doing it is using something like syslog-ng or rsyslog to transfer the logs from the Suricata box, the E files, from the Suricata box to a centralized, Sagan platform. So logs can be analyzed there. And that's what I'm going to be kind of talking about today. The idea here is that I can split up the load. I don't have to put that extra load or whatnot on my IDS platform. All I have to do is get the logs shipped over. And then now that we have these logs, we need some place to put our threat storage, our IOCs and whatnot. Our backend is pretty simple. We started working on this for other reasons in Sagan a long time ago, but the backend is basically a MariaDB backend. The tables are pretty flat, they're pretty simple, because this stuff is information that we're going to hand over to our analysts. So we don't do anything like sticks or anything like that. It's kind of overkill for what we need. So it's kind of basically kind of a flat kind of table here with IP addresses, like in this particular case, IP addresses. But hashes are very similar. So instead of the IP address, it would be a hash at the very top of that table. And then we have a linking table that we can add and subtract to for the different types of indicators that we want. So like ID number 3 being malicious, or 4 something from our honeypot, or advisory could be just something that we want our security team to know about. And of course, things like Tor and stuff like that. So that linking table allows us to, as we're adding into IOCs, add in more linking options as we want to in the future or not. And then finally, as I said, while we are putting everything into a MariaDB backend, you could use Redis. The source code for this, which is available in the Sagan tree, is pretty simple. It's mostly PHP routines and whatnot to query the database. You could easily alter that to put all your IOCs into, say, a Redis database if you wanted to. But we do use Redis for things like the API keys. And the API keys are just simply SHA-1 hashes that are assigned to particular devices that are out in the field. So that whenever Sagan starts up and wants to make a query, it can that's the way it kind of authenticates to the back end. And then so it basically says get this particular hash, and if the hash has a colon right at the end of it, it has read-write access, and then it tells us who owns that particular key. I'm only telling you this because if you look at the intel.php source code that comes with Sagan, it might be a little bit confusing right there. So we have the logs, we have Suricata running, we got that tuned the way that we want to. The logs, the E files are going from the IDS appliance back over to our back end. We have our database set up, we've loaded it with data. We have everything kind of in place, but now more the question is how do we make the threat intel queries? The queries themselves are pretty straightforward. They're simple GET requests. So obviously where you see blue.qis.io, that would be your own IP address that you would have for wherever you would want. That could be internal, external, whatnot. The API key, which is the SHA-1 hash assigned to that particular device, and then what you want to look up. In this particular case, it's an IP address. It could be a hash, it could be a URL, it could be different other things. And then I'm doing the pretty option behind it. Obviously, the appliance doesn't really care, or Sagan doesn't really care that it's pretty. But the ultimate idea here is that you get this simple output back. And it basically consists of who made the query, what the code was it malicious? You can have different comments in it. And then if you notice, there's a C time and an M time. The C time is the creation date of the IOC, and the M time is actually the modification date. And it comes up a little bit later, as you could probably guess. The C time is never altered, The C time is never altered. The M time, when we see certain IOCs, we update that. The idea here is if we have somebody using a backend server for CNC and it's over a year old, but we're still seeing activity from it, we want to be able to give it a means to update that particular record on the back end to say that we still see this particular CNC server still active. And then finally what we have to get down to is we have to configure Sagan. Because remember, Sagan's going to be making all the queries. So the E file comes in, Sagan gets it, tears it apart, and then sends its queries back over to the back end. So I won't go through all the configuration options in here, but we take advantage of a lot of things like caching. Because whenever a GET request from the Sagan appliance is fairly expensive. So what we end up doing is, say, make a query for a particular IP address. We keep that in cache for a certain amount of time. So for instance, like 2 hours. And what we see is, and obviously we don't query things like, for instance, private IP addresses, RFC 1918, your internal addresses, there's a skip network. So we don't query anything that we don't have to. The cache time tells it how long in minutes to keep those particular threats. So if you go in and make a modification, it's not really going to roll out to your sensors unless you fully restart them for at least 120 minutes, unless you change that particular side. The other stuff is just things like how big of space do you want to make available for different types of threat intel data. And then you have to load up some rules. These are some rules. Actually, it's just called Suricata rules right now. I'm in the process of breaking those up. I'll have those done. So Suricata blue dot rules go against things like your threat intel backend. So we'll make those requests. Since we're here, figured we might as well do some GeoIP rules since we're already breaking the data down from Suricata, and ATOS, which ATOS is just time-based rules. So for instance, I see SSH traffic from the sensor to the sensor at 3 a.m., and I would find that suspicious. So we could write a signature based off time events and whatnot. I should point out too, well here, actually I'll do that right here. So Sagan, as I said, natively pulls in things like syslog from routers and stuff like that. And a lot of times this is unstructured data. Fortunately, many devices and things are going to more of a JSON format. Every now and then you'll get CSV and stuff like that, but it's usually unstructured. There's a part in Sagan where you can tell it, hey, I expect to see some JSON data, so please look for it. And you see where it says parse message, parse program. Sometimes, I won't go into technical detail, but they'll blend the JSON into the program field. But the idea here is it tells Sagan, hey, expect some JSON data. At the very bottom is a thing called the message map. Since we're sending it over syslog, the JSON is going to show up as a part of the message field of the syslog data. But we have to have a way to be able to tell it what that data is, what it represents. So we actually use a mapping system. So when Sagan loads up, it says, well, what do you want me to look for exactly? So you'll see where it says software Suricata. It says, hey, I have this thing out here, it's called Suricata. And it should have a thing called an event type. And you'll notice these things line up a lot from Suricata. So, you know, dest IP, message, well, message not, but proto and whatnot. The reason is because as I said, the Sagan side has some similarities to the Suricata side, and we blatantly sometimes just say, "Wow, that's a really great idea," and then pull it directly from Victor and everybody else. So so a lot of the mappings will be the same. The idea here, though, is like, let's say you had some other forwarding device that did JSON. You could build a mapping syntax for it. So that's so that Sagan, whenever it sees the mapping for the JSON, that it knows what it is, that the MD5 like while Suricata might call it MD5, some other device might call it, MD5 sum, so that you can give it to a 1-to-1 ratio. And the idea is it creates like an internal scoring and picks the best score. So in this particular case, it would probably hit most every single time. And then you just start up Sagan. So then I always prefer starting up Sagan in the foreground because I'm debugging it and whatnot. And you get this kind of, this is a pretty generic what it looks like when it starts up. So it gives you things like just basic statistics, how many logs it's processed, ignored, any thread exhaustion that it sees. And you'll see where it says JSON input and the ways that it got that JSON and whatnot in time. But if you keep going down, then you'll start seeing things like the reputation stuff. So for instance, this is the IP reputation stuff. So if you look in the the cache right now, we have 1,500 roughly IP addresses. Again, we don't look up every single IP address because we're ignoring some RFC 1918 and internal stuff as well. We find whenever we do this, our cache rates, which you'll see right under it, we hit a lot of stuff that's directly out of cache. If we didn't do this, this wouldn't scale very well. And in really large environments, this will not scale because you'll have just way too many IPs getting queried at the same time. Once it's doing about 100 queries per second on the Sagan side for just simply IP addresses, it just simply doesn't scale. But once it kind of starts up and then settles down and then it starts hitting the cache, the load goes way down and the queries start. Same thing with file hashes. So it gives you the files that it has seen and keeps those hashes in memory, and then of course does the same thing, keeps those in cache for 120 minutes or whatnot. It also gives you like your query rate as well. We can do things with like URLs, so we can take URLs and do the same thing with the back end, which basically will do those queries for you. And then you have things like file name reputation. This one's kind of okay. You have certain things like ransomware, which will drop certain types of file names. You probably wouldn't see that over here, but if you happen to have a very unique file name that you wanted to watch for, it would be easy to do here. And file and log analysis, if we're getting things from like Windows servers and we see a README file from a piece of ransomware that's very unique, we can write signatures for that. But anyway, since we're already here, we can look for things like file names. And then also TLS JA3 reputation, so you can stack up the database and load your applications in there, which may even include, by the way, whitelisted applications, because my thought is, even if I have the SOC, or Security Operations Center, somebody sitting in there, any kind of data that we give to them is going to help them. So for instance, if we say we have this exploit and it's this terrible, terrible thing, but the J3 hash tells us that it's actually I don't know, SharePoint or something Microsoft related, then we can take that information and go, well, this looks like a valid, whitelisted J3. Maybe this is a false positive or whatnot. But we can look for malicious traffic as well in there. So now we got all this stuff together, we have to create some Sagan rules for detection. Now, as I kept saying, because this usually gets kind of confusing, the rules look a lot like Suricata. As I said, we do that on purpose for reasons, for everything from maintenance reasons to whatnot, plus our team already knows it. Our team already studies Suricata rules, so for us to adopt it, it just makes sense. So what we're saying here in this particular rule is look in the flow. You'll see what it says event type. So we're looking for the event type Suricata-flow or pipe flow. And the reason it's both is because whenever it comes in through me, or it comes in slightly different. So that's an or statement, basically. So it looks for one of these two types of events. And then we call the blue dot processor. And the blue dot processor says, I want to do a reputation lookup. I want to look for both sides. I want to look at both IP addresses, granted that let's assume that they're both public IP addresses. If one of them is private, it will discard it. But I want to look up any IP addresses that I have within this and look up. I don't have any kind of time signatures for this, so I don't know if it's malicious, if we've seen it as Tor, is it a honey? Have we seen it past maybe our honeypots in the past, or is it related to a proxy? We can also do things like MD5 and SHA-1 hashes. So again, this is taking the data from the E file. It's looking for the event type of files or file info. We exclude ourselves in this lookup. It's the content not. And then we just say blue dot type, I want to do a file hash lookup. And then say just for malicious. If it comes back, it creates a, Sagan will write E file, similar to how Suricata does an E file out. I should point out something. When in Suricata, there gets set a flow ID. So if Sagan's following the file and it finds this event and it says, oh, this is a terrible thing, I don't like this file hash is fine, it'll actually take the flow ID from Suricata and adopt it. And the reason that we do that, from our analysts, they want to be able to go through and find the information as quick as possible. The flow ID already allows them to do that. So we can say this flow ID is valid for not only these particular, IDS events, but you can also look in the log to find that particular flow ID to find out, what happened there from the signature standpoint. So this is for, it looks for malicious hash. This looks for URLs, so you can kind of see a pattern. So just doing event_type, HTTP, and then we're looking for a URL, and is it malicious or not? So fairly straightforward to generate these type of rules. And this is a file name lookup. It does kind of the same thing, except looking at the hash, it looks at the file name instead. Now, so the other issue that I mentioned was being able to rotate this data out as it gets older. So you'll see in here, it's just like before, we're using flow data, and we're going through it and doing queries against the reputation database for that, just like we did before. In this particular case, you'll see where it says mdate_effective period. So what that's saying is the modified date within the last 2 months. If it's not within the last 2 months, then it's going to discard it. It's going to say, well, I'm not as interested in this. And then of course it says, is it malicious, or is it Tor, is it a proxy, or whatnot. This one has the same thing, but this one goes off the creation date, or the C date. So it's saying, was this created within the last 6 months? So you want to be able to differentiate, because, as I said, the C date is the creation time of the thing. So if the command and control or whatever you're looking for is up and it's been 6 months, but it's still active, this wouldn't catch it. So you'd want to go off the M time. Last, I was just going to touch on real quick. Since we already had this data, we just started writing these other rules that we thought were kind of interesting, where we use geo-IP information, which I know Suricata has already built into it. We set a variable called home country, which you can put in your abbreviations for your country codes, US and whatnot, CA, whatnot. And so you have a flag like it is not. So for instance, if I see SSH traffic, and the country code has a destination that is not within my known areas that I want to SSH to, let's fire off a rule on that. And then home country is actually a variable that you set in the Sagan YAML file. And then finally, this is the ATOS rules. So you can do, as I said, with SSH traffic, or you can do it with anything, obviously. But the idea here being that you could create kind of time-based alerts. So if I have an RDP session happen at 3 in the morning, I notice at very large organizations that these kind of rules don't scale well, but if you have, the point is because large organizations typically have staff RDPing and SSHing 24/7, so it might not be a useful rule. But for smaller organizations, 3 a.m. To 5 a.m. SSH traffic might be deemed kind of suspicious. So as you can see, it'll say alert time, days and hours. The days and hours can also be variables that you can set, like in the Sagan YAML. So you can make it a variable throughout all the particular rules. The blue dot source code, which is, as you said, I mean, really to put all this stuff together is very, very complex. And I'm sure it doesn't seem that very complex to you guys. It's more just setting up several different pieces of software. This is where you can get the source code for the blue dot stuff. It is the intel.php, the schemas, and things of that nature. It's very, very straightforward. If you're thinking about deploying something like this or have any issues with it, please feel free to hit me up. You can hit me up on this if you want to just make an issue on GitHub. That would be fine, and I'll be more than happy to hit you up and work with you on it. And that is pretty much my rundown. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and this has been an awesome SuriCon as usual. So thank you.